All right. I'm going to take a swig here because it's allergy season again. Seems like allergy season never leaves. Not in Pennsylvania, that's right. Because in the winter you get all this funky mold stuff going on, so it's like it's never ending. We are going to shift gears. Next week, Brent is going to go back into Job. So I don't know if we just like these themes of suffering here, and we want to make you all suffer. But it's just, for me, I guess as I wrap this up, there's a Bible story that I have here, and it's one that we all know, we're familiar with. But for me, suffering is such a dominant theme in our personal life, in my family, and I know I'm not alone. I know that this is definitely not a woe is me, but we are not a family that just kind of plugs along and makes life look easy. We have so many major, big cataclysmic events that have happened in our family. And again, I know we're not alone. I know that there are so many people suffering, and for me, this study has been, I guess, maybe a little bit of a selfish study, because there are moments where I feel like hope is so far away and it's so distant, and it's such a struggle. Some days, it usually doesn't last long, but there are some days where hope just seems so far away, and it seems so abstract. And then there are other times where it just comes into crystal clear focus. And so I guess this is kind of, telling my roller coaster journey, and helping me through some of these troubled moments, and joining with other people. And the discussions have been so rich in this class. And I appreciate all of the feedback, the questions, the comments. For me, this has been so helpful. And it's given me such a deeper understanding of who God is and who Christ is in the middle of our troubles. And so, I want to start with that. And I think, just to recap, going through all of these roller coaster emotions has been so important for me personally. I tell people all the time, whenever I go and I do trainings on abuse, inevitably questions come up about my faith. How are you still able to preach and believe in God? And so many people who go through these big events, they just question God. And I can't speak for other people. I can only speak for myself. And the story that I tell people is, my story is that I never questioned God's goodness. But boy, was I so angry at God. Hateful angry at God, at what he had allowed. The innocent lives that were shattered by my dad, that some have just not recovered, and maybe never will. The cruelty that God allowed, that God could have stopped. He could have stopped it with a heart attack. We see some of these people, that we mentioned just this morning, who are dying of cancer. People that are young, people that have so much life to live yet, and they're dying of cancer. And then you see these monsters who create so much destruction in so many lives that will guaranteed to be generational. It causes this generational destruction. So for me, my journey through all of this has been to just, point daggers at God and just shout and scream. And so when I tell people why my faith is still strong, it's because this congregation allowed me to yell at God. I'll never forget that sermon where I just yelled at God for 30 minutes straight. And then at the end, everybody came up and they surrounded me. I think, Charles, you said, "Why have you not preached this years ago?" Because we all feel that tension of just questioning God's ability to stop all of this crap that happens in life. And as you look at the scriptures, that yelling and screaming and shouting and pointing your finger at God is such an important part in the lives of so many people in the scriptures. Job did it. Job yelled at God. You're like a lion who waits in the bushes, and when I walk by, you come out and you attack. Job is indicting God, saying, "You did this, or at least you allowed this." David, over and over and over, just yells at God. And so that's has been an important part of my process, and this congregation has allowed me to do that. The other thing is kind of struggling with, I guess, finding my identity as a Christian and using that suffering to help other people. And I've kind of made that a life mission of mine. And quite frankly, it's been a horrific, terrible journey for the most part. And I wouldn't change it for anything. It's not rewarding. It doesn't energize you. You don't check in at the end of the day and be like, "Wow, look at all the good that's coming of this." It's an uphill battle. I've been threatened to be sued. I don't know how many times. I've had death wished on me and my kids. It's a bizarre journey and stuff that I don't share ever with anybody until now. So what we do with our suffering matters, and that was last week's lesson. In 2 Corinthians chapter 2, where Paul talks about comforting people. We give comfort because God comforts us in our time of need. And in our comfort, we comfort you. And in our distress, we comfort you. We do these things for your comfort and your salvation. It's such a selfless look at life. And so I hope that our family has been modeling that for people. I don't know how successful we've been at it, but that's what we do. And so today's lesson, as we wrap this up, is on finding significance through insignificance. And the story, again, it's so familiar to us, but when Dorcas was restored to life, I'm just going to read this story in the scriptures. It's recorded in Acts chapter 9, and then we'll talk about this as a group. And I want to hear what you guys glean from this, and it may be something totally different than what I do, and that's what I like about discussion. Starting in verse 36. Now there was in Joppa a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas, which translated means gazelle. You're welcome. She was full of good works and acts of charity. In these days she became ill and died. And when they had washed her, they laid her in an upper room. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, hearing that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him, urging him, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter rose and went with them. And when he arrived, they took him to the upper room. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other garments that Dorcas made while she was with them. But Peter put them all outside and knelt down and prayed. And turning to the body, he said, "Tabitha, arise." And she opened her eyes. And when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and raised her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. And it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And he stayed in Joppa for many days with one Simon, a tanner. That's it. That's our scripture for today. Several things that I gather from this. I don't know why she was called Gazelle. If you know anything about gazelles, I guess they're nimble, they're quick, they kind of don't stop, they run with lots of energy, and they just don't ever give up. And maybe that's why she was given the name Gazelle, because she just was a hard worker. And quite honestly, I've always read this story and thought of Bill Riggs. Bill repeatedly said, there is no glamour in working for God. And he said, you just go in there. And he said, maybe I'm old school. And he used to talk to me privately, but I know he said it publicly many, many times. And he would say, maybe I don't get it. Or maybe I'm missing something. He said, it's just me. But my take is, as a Christian, you do things whether you like it or not. If you're blessing other people, you just roll up your sleeves and you grin and you bear it and you just do the work, and then you die. And I thought, how prophetic for Bill's life. Like, if you could sum up his life, that was his life. You grin and you bear it. DP in Ecuador, I know. Like, how about the painting? He hated painting. These painting projects, going into people's homes and painting them, he couldn't hide his emotions. He hated painting. But he didn't complain. And at the end of that, we went and visited one of the homes that Bill and another group of guys had gone out and helped. And Rusty told us the story of this woman. And I mean, you want to talk about gut-wrenching, heartbreaking story. And Bill didn't know any of that when he went. And he went, and then, they were working on concrete. They worked on painting. Bill didn't know any of that story. He just went and assumed there's probably some story behind this person's life. I'm just here to provide labor. Bill, to his own admission, was not a preacher, was not a teacher. He didn't like it. He would do it. That was another thing. He would just grin and bear it. Every now and then he said, I guess I should be on the rotation and put my time in. That was his approach to it. He didn't do it often. He admitted it wasn't his gift. But he would grin and bear it. And he would just work. And I look back at his life and I think, how many lives were radically changed because of that man's service? I mean, radically changed for the good. And I see Dorcas, Tabitha, with the same kind of mentality. And again, maybe that's just my take on it, but I don't see her getting any recognition. She's not one of these superheroes of the Bible. She's not mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. She's not this big name person. She doesn't have a big, huge platform. She's in a tiny little village in the middle of nowhere. A pretty insignificant town. And listen how Luke describes her. She was full of good works and acts of charity. What's he pointing to? I mean, it's her heart. She did these things. We don't know what her position. We don't know if she was like happily making all this stuff. For all we know, she was grinning and bearing it. We don't know for sure. But we know the impact that she had on people. We know that, I mean, I can assume she had a pretty rough life. Again, that's probably me reading into the text. But I don't get any indication that she was well-to-do, that she was a woman of prominence. There's no indication whatsoever that that's the case. And she made clothing. You want to talk about a glamorous job, and from the outside, an insignificant job. She's not knocking doors. She's not witnessing to people about Christ. She's not, like that we know of. She's not doing anything, but she's not known for anything but making clothes for widows, for people in need. And for me, this whole scene with Peter, I think is really fascinating for a number of reasons. One, Peter was very, very busy. Peter wasn't really known for dropping everything and leaving. I mean, to my knowledge, this is the only time I see Peter in the Bible where he drops everything. And he intentionally went to this place, which is a pretty far hike. If I remember right, I think it's like a 10-mile hike or something like that. Peter immediately gets up and he goes. When he arrived, they took him to the upper room. All the widows stood beside him, beside Peter, weeping and showing tunics and other garments that Dorcas made. Why is this important to the story? Yeah. And maybe even more specifically, what impact she made on their lives. It wasn't just them saying she was such a good woman, we miss her. They were showing the things that she had made for them.
It was kind of like an admiration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, for me, it's always been a very moving story for me. And I can imagine what it was like for Peter being there. I can imagine Peter was very moved by this.
She was unknown to him?
Yeah, to our knowledge, yeah. She was unknown to Peter. And I think that's significant too. It's not like he's pulling favors for anybody. But Peter had to have been moved by this because he puts them all outside. And this scene is really parallel to another story that we see with Jesus. Do you remember the little girl that's also recorded in Luke, the Gospel of Luke? So Luke's familiar with that story as he's writing this story. Do you remember Jesus and the little girl? What's he do? Everybody's wailing and weeping, and it's this big, crazy scene. What does Jesus do? He puts them all out, except for the girl's parents. And what's he say to her? Little girl, rise. Right? It's the same thing that Peter was there with the little girl. And I think it's really important that Peter is mimicking almost to the T what Jesus had done for this little girl.
One thing that I always wonder as I read this is, why do you think they sent for Peter? Did they expect him to raise her from the dead?
I'm not really sure. It's a great question. I'm not really sure.
He hadn't done that before, right? He hadn't raised anybody from the dead.
This is pretty early in Acts, and so I don't recall. I didn't look that closely, but I don't recall any other story where any of the disciples had raised anybody post-ascension.
It makes you wonder what they were. Was it comfort or?
My guess, 100% guess, is that it was more comfort. They didn't ask him, that we know of, they didn't ask him to raise her up.
So I've got to a different take on that.
Okay.
And you hit, at the beginning, it's a small town.
Yeah, tiny town.
She's taking care of widows. And notice, then calling the saints and widows. My opinion, the widows they're talking about are not saints. They're just people in the community.
Yeah.
Now, Tabitha apparently has the gift of making garments.
Yes.
There's a widow problem, if you will. There's a problem with people in need. I don't know if they're looking so much for comfort as they are for direction.
Yeah.
What are we going to do? We heard that, Peter's not very far away.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a long walk, but it's not very far by their standards. Get him, get up here. They show him, or they show her to him, and look at everything she's done. Now the question comes up next, isn't there, you're going to raise her from the dead? It's more like, what do we do now?
That's a great take. This almost brings me back to Acts 6 when there's this problem with food distribution. The problems don't go away. The problems are always going to be there with taking care of widows, poor widows. These are not well-to-do, clearly not well-to-do people who get these garments and they're like, add another one to my collection. Like this is do or die. These are naked people who Jesus describes who need to be clothed. These are hungry people who need to be fed. Clearly there's a need. Small town, limited resources. We experience these kinds of things in smaller churches. Think small communities. You're much more limited in what you're able to do financially, manpower, on and on and on and on and on. You're so limited. I think that's a great take. There's a huge need. And maybe they're not looking for direction for comfort as much as they are direction. What do we do now? We have all these widows that they're left high and dry. It's a problem. It's going to be a problem. And I think it's fascinating and I think it's amazing and I think it's important that Peter, the first thing he does, he doesn't address that. He does, but he doesn't, Peter puts them all outside, and I think at this point, they're probably scratching their heads like, what's going on? What's he doing? Is he praying with family? It's this big question mark. What's he up to? Peter puts them all outside. He kneels down and he prays. And turning to the body, he said, "Tabitha, rise." Maybe again I'm reading into this, but Luke has a habit. I observe patterns because that's how my brain is wired. And I observe these patterns. And Luke seems to draw significant attention to eyes, eye contact. We have back in Luke, I forget what chapter, when Peter denies Jesus, Luke's account gives the most detail with the eye connection. Luke slows it way down. When you look in the original language, Luke is doing some really cool stuff with these time transitions, with the tenses that he uses, and it's really incredible when you actually dig into the original language what Luke's intentionally doing. It's almost like he zooms in on this scene, and everything else in the background doesn't go away, but it blurs out, and it like slows time down. And Luke records this. He says, "And when the rooster crowed, Peter remembered that Jesus said, before the rooster crows, you would deny me 3 times." And Jesus turned and looked directly at Peter. And Peter turned and wept bitterly. Luke records in Acts chapter 4, Peter and John are going up the steps to the temple, and there's a lame man, lame from birth, crying out. He's begging for alms. And on their way up, Peter says, you remember the famous line? Silver and gold we do not have. What I do have, I give you in the name of Jesus. Get up and walk. Right before Peter said that, you know what Peter said to him? Look at us. Yeah. And the man looks up. And what he's saying is not like, hey, look over here. The guy obviously knew. When you're begging for money, you're aware of your surroundings. You know when somebody's walking by, especially when you're crying out. Peter wasn't saying, look over here. Peter's saying what? Look at us. Eye to eye, we see you. We see your heart, we see your soul. I think the byproduct of that healing was incredibly significant because Luke then records that the man walks into the temple, which is, I think, powerful because it is packed. And everybody recognized the man. They knew who he was. They knew what he was. They knew his disability. And he's running and jumping and skipping. And the very next thing that Luke records is that thousands of people came to believe in Christ. These are significant events. What do we do with suffering? Are we the person who walks by and is like, oh, whatever? Or are we the person who walks by and says, well, God will take care of it? Or are we the person who stops and makes eye contact and meets people where they are? And Peter clearly is that kind of person. So again, back to this text. He says, Tabitha, arise, and she opened her eyes. Listen very closely what Luke is doing here. This is intentional. She opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. I think that's so significant what Luke is recording here, especially in relation to Peter and what Peter's experienced. And, Peter has this thing with eye contact. It's really important to Peter. And my best guess is that Peter had his eyes full of tears. And imagine knowing what you know about Peter. I mean, Peter is a hot mess most of the time. And knowing what you know about Peter and Peter's heart and Peter's, absolute devotion to God and to Christ. Imagine him being the first person you see when you died. She left this earth. When you die and you come back, and Peter's the person you're looking at. I think it's so powerful what Luke is recording here. And I don't know what was going through her mind. I don't know if she was like, but I'm just Tabitha. I'm just somebody who goes into the corner of my house, if she even had one, and I knit. And why is Peter at my bedside? Raising me from the dead. I don't know. There's significance in the insignificant. What we see as insignificant. And he gave her his hand and raised her up. And then calling the saints and widows, good point. I didn't notice that in the text, and I think you're 100% right. I think the widows are not believers, which didn't stop Tabitha from taking care of them, right? Always. That's right. Christianity is not this light that we put under a basket and hide it from the rest of the people, right? We do good works. We do what's right always to everyone. Peter presents her alive. He calls the saints and the widows. He presents her alive. And it became known throughout all Joppa, and significantly, many believed in the Lord, no doubt including many of these widows. And he stayed in Joppa for many days with one Simon, a tanner. This is important. What we do with our grief and our suffering matters. It matters now. It matters 5 minutes from now. It matters 5 years from now. And it matters 5,000 years from now. The things that we do in the name of Christ and in the name of the kingdom, it has these generational effects. And those ripples, the bad things we do, I experience that in my family. The bad, the crappy things, the destruction, the damage, the abuse, that stuff has ripple effects that go on and on and on and on and on. And we can either roll over and just accept that and say, man, this is terrible, this is horrible, there's so much evil in the world, and we can hunker down and really become inward focused and say, boy, the world is scary and ugly out there, and there's a lot of pain, and if you stick your neck out there, somebody's going to come and they're going to chop it off, and so we better just really hunker down and stay away from those people out there. We can take that approach, which I think is wildly dangerous. Or we can counter suffering and evil and cancer and, whatever it is. We can counter that poverty. We can counter that by doing good works for others. Doing what's right always. To everyone. Not just to people we know, not just to those who are on the inside, not just to the saints. We do what's right for everyone always, and look what God does with this. Right? Peter didn't do this. God did this, and God took the seeds that Peter... Can you imagine if Peter was like, man, I hear you. I know you guys are heartbroken. I know this is sad. But people die all the time. That's just a part of life. I'm on this trip. I'm 10 miles away. Sorry, I can't go. Not right now. I can't leave my post. Can you imagine what would have happened or not happened if that had been Peter's approach? And so this impulse to do what's right always is important too. Most of us have a tendency to put things off and be like, I'll get around to it. When my schedule clears up, I think that can be a dangerous thing too. And I see so often this impulse with so many of Christ's disciples. This impulse to do good, this impulse to move, this impulse to not stay located in one place and just say, well, this is my post, this is my box, don't mess with my Christian box, leave me alone, I'm locked in my office, I'm doing my work, just let me be. I don't see that in the Bible. I see people who are so impulsive to move, to help people. And I think, again, summing everything up, I think that's where we begin to find hope through other people when times are troubled. And there's a lot of trouble in the world. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of heavy stuff going on. we can, should, and will make a difference in the lives of other people. Thank you guys for everything. I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you, Brent, for taking over, going back into Job. We're just going to kind of ping pong back and forth, taking turns for a few months at a time. And this has been very enjoyable, and I've learned a lot from you guys, so thank you. All right, we're going to take a break, and we'll see you in about 15 minutes or so.